заході нашої інформаційно-просвітницької кампанії «Що таке північна модель» або «Модель рівності». Сьогоднішній наш захід присвячений питанню того, як правоохоронні органи можуть долучитися до реалізації цієї моделі, як запровадження моделі рівності змінює стосунки між поліцією і людьми, зокрема жінками в проституції, і навіщо це, зокрема, потрібно поліції. Ми сьогодні маємо дуже цікавих доповідачів і доповідачок, і ви можете прочитати їхні біографії на нашій сторінці подій у Фейсбуці. І зараз я передаю слово очільниці громадської організації «Центр розвиток демократії» пані Елі Ламах. Ця організація, власне, була першою, яка почала говорити про необхідність моделі рівності в Україні. Прошу, пані Ело, вам слово, і у вас 5 хвилин.
Доброго дня, і я сразу хочу сказати, що наша організація «Центр розвиток демократії» представлена не тільки мною, а цей захід модерує Марія Дмитрієва, і ми спільно працюємо з такою мережою «Резистанта» і з Оленою Зайцевою та іншими громадськими діячками, які намагаються представити в Україні, що таке модель рівності, що таке або шведська модель. В той же час ми спільно цю кампанію створили з Українською фундацією громадського здоров'я Legal Life в Україні і з громадською радою про МФО рівні можливості при Верховній Раді України. Я дуже дякую всім із секретаріату МФО за те, що вони нам допомагають, підтримують поширення і саме підтримують інформаційну кампанію, яка направлена на ряд заходів для висвітлення в Україні і ознайомлення не тільки центральних органів виконавчої влади, не тільки поліцію та інших структур, а в першу чергу громадськість, громадян і громадянок України, щоб вони знали, як можна протидіяти проституції, допомогти жінкам вийти з проституції. І в той же час я би хотіла сказати, що інформаційна кампанія не почалася з сьогоднішнього заходу. Інформаційну кампанію ми почали 26 березня, коли ми провели захід «Вийти з кола насильства», досвід жінок, які пережили проституцію. І я дуже дякую всім учасницям і міжнародним, і українським за те, що вони говорили вголос про свої проблеми, як їх стосувалася саме ця проблема проституції. І у рамках цього заходу жінки, які пережили сексуальну експлуатацію, і соціальні працівники, соціальні працівниці різних країн розповідали про перешкоди на шляху виходу з проституції. Сьогоднішній захід я так само дякую нашим організаторам і нашим, скажімо, органам, центральним органам виконавчої влади за те, що вони приєдналися, а в першу чергу Міністерство внутрішніх справ з їхніми структурними підрозділами, Нацполіції, міграційній службі, за те, що вони будуть слухати сьогоднішній захід. І хотіла би окремо подякувати нашим всім міжнародним експертам і експерткам за те, що ви долучилися. Дуже дякуємо вам за те, що ви приєдналися і будете ділити своїм досвідом. І в першу чергу це Міа де Вічі з Ірландії, Мац Паулсон з Швеції, Домінік Маншам з Канади. Я вже не буду перераховувати ваші регалії, але хочу подякувати від нас всіх за те, що ви вкладаєте в цю подію і нашу кампанію свої сили і ділитесь з нами досвідом. Це і Саріт Перець з Ізраїлю, і Алан Кейтон з Великої Британії, і Альда Йоханстір з Ісландії. Всім вам дякуємо і чекаємо, що у нас будуть цікаві презентації і гарна дискусія. Дякую дуже всім.
Дякую, пані Ело. Я бачу, що у нас тут долучилося вже майже 40 осіб. Я сподіваюся, інші, хто планували до нас долучитися, вони ще долучаться. Я б ще хотіла згадати Національну раду жінок України, які теж з нами є співорганізаторами цих заходів, і подякувати CAP International, коаліції за викорінення проституції, які допомагають нам у тому, щоб знайти людей, які найкраще можуть розповісти про досвід їхніх країн у цій сфері. З наступного заходу вони будуть нашими офіційними партнерами на всі подальші заходи цієї кампанії. Добре, для нас було принциповим, щоб ця кампанія була зосереджена на досвіді жінок в проституції. І саме тому кожен наш подальший захід починатиметься із презентацій жінок, які вийшли з проституції і які з цією темою активно працюють у своїх країнах. І я маю честь зараз надати слово пані Мії Дефіче з Ірландії, яка займалася активно просуванням моделі рівності в Ірландії і зараз працює, зокрема, як тренерка з поліцією в Ірландії. Прошу, пані Мія, вам слово.
Hi, and many thanks for the invitation, and it's great to be here. I can't underestimate how important the role of the police is on this issue. My own experience, I spent 6 years in mainly street prostitution in Dublin, in Ireland, and it's because of that lived experience and all that I witnessed that when I managed to exit, the police were very important for me to reach, because they played a role. Because when you step into prostitution, your world becomes very small, and so the only human contact you tend to have is with the other women beside you, and the men who buy you, and the police. So I had a very positive relationship with the police in Ireland at the time, but their hands were tied in so much as how they could protect us, because our law was different at the time. So I wouldn't have shared. In the 6 years, I experienced a gang rape and 3 other rapes, and I witnessed many heinous crimes on others, including my friend who was trafficked. But at the time, Ireland's law, we had laws around prostitution, in that we'd laws for soliciting on both sides, we'd brothel keeping laws, etc. But the act of prostitution remained legal, and that was the loophole. So I was viewed as a criminal, and could be taken to court, and was taken to court, and I have many cautions. So when you're in that world, and although I got to know quite a few of the officers well, I wouldn't share that with them, because I was viewed as a criminal. So when I was raped, it didn't even occur to me to tell the police, because who would listen and who would care and where would it go, etc. And it was kind of seen as something that just happened to us. So when I exited, it was I joined a campaign here to turn off the red light, which was to adopt the Nordic model, as Sweden had done, and other countries. And in 2017, Ireland did just that. Now, that was a process where I gave evidence, and the police gave evidence, and at the time, their evidence, there was up to 40 criminal gangs running prostitution rackets around Ireland at the time. So it's highly organized and highly criminalized, lots of and mainly Eastern European women. And I would have witnessed that on the street. But we changed the law in 2017, whereby we criminalize those who pay for sex, decriminalize those who sell. And at the moment, we're still working on exit routes and having a formal strategy. And I've just taken on a new role to run that campaign. But the police I'm watching the time. When I think back now, if the law had been the way it is now, when I was there, you know, I would never have received a caution. I would never have been brought to court. And I would have, in fact, sometimes I get frustrated because there are many things that would have been of value to the police that I would have shared, you know, intelligence-wise, with things I had seen, my own crimes against my own body, etc. And since the law is still in its infancy, but we have just published an interim report, and the evidence and the feedback from both the women and the police is that the intelligence is improving, relationships between the police and the women are improving, and they are more inclined to come forward to report violence. In fact, we've had a few convictions. So things are going in a very positive way, and the police now support the law, and they see the value in it. They have turned their focus to a demand focus, and they now see the women as being the more vulnerable party, whereas Ireland historically would have viewed it the other way around. I have spent 12 months or so with the British police, where I put together and developed a training program, and about 400 police officers. Really, my objective is, I spent 6 years in a world that I have insight into and an understanding of. And because prostitution, very often it is prostituted women, we can be hard to reach, we can be hard to understand, we have complicated lives. And if I can, like, the police were always there for me, although they couldn't help in those 6 years. So I just feel now, if I have that insight, it could be of value and share with them. Because and the feedback has been good, and I hope to run it here with our own police, because you're asking police forces to totally reverse how they have always historically looked at the issue, you know, switching it from the women to the men. But realistically, you know, in Europe at the moment, the pimps and the traffickers are winning, you know. And trading in women and girls' bodies is larger now than ever before. So we have to get our heads together. And so that's why I'm delighted today is happening, because I don't like when they're winning. And the traffic will continue, and it will grow unless we face the root cause, which is the demand. And that's, you know, logically, that's the only way. And it is now, the Nordic model is now proving to be the strongest legislative piece against, it works against sex trafficking. Also, for society in general, to me, prostitution, you know, it's the cruelest form of gender inequality. You know, it's at its worst, and it needs to end. That's I'm watching the time, but so that was, and just to thank you guys, and you know, like, again, I can't emphasize how valuable the role of the police is on this issue. The frontline service, they're very often, you know, the first people the women come in contact to. You know, in Ireland, we're working a lot of the Eastern European women trusting the police doesn't, you know, mightn't come naturally. They mightn't be the first person that they trust because of their own experience in their own countries, or on the way to Ireland or Sweden or wherever. So it's breaking down those barriers. That is happening in Ireland, you know, but our law is only 3 years old. So, but we have, you know, the evidence so far is positive, you know. So I'll finish there. I think that's my time. And thank you all.
Дякую, Мія, за дуже влучний початок для нашої сьогоднішньої розмови. Хотіла нагадати всім учасницям і учасникам сьогоднішнього заходу, що у нас працює синхронний переклад. Для того, щоб слухати синхронний переклад, ви натискаєте внизу екрана кнопочку із зображенням земної кулі і вибираєте для української іспанський. Оце буде канал, на якому наш переклад українською. Відповідно, для тих, хто говорить англійською, для них канал англійський. Мія вклалася в свій час просто ідеально, і я хотіла б зараз запросити до слова нашого колегу зі Швеції Матса Паулсона. Він є старшим радником Шведської агенції з гендерної рівності, і він поділиться із нами досвідом Швеції. Прошу, пане Матсе, вам слово.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to the organizing committee. It will be very interesting. It was an interesting start, and I would just agree what Mia said before, because what she said about the problem when the police first meet with a woman in prostitution, especially maybe women from Nigeria and Eastern Europe, we have to convince them that we are on their side, so to speak, which takes a long time sometimes, depending on their experience from another time or another place, maybe. My background is from the police. Today working since 2.5 years at the Swedish Gender Equality Agency. The reason is that this agency, my new agency, has a national coordinating responsibility for all kind of trafficking, all purposes, and also for prostitution. So we are, so to speak, the national coordinator. That means that we are not operational, not me at least, not at the time. We are working behind our laptops, sometimes extremely boring, but it has to be done as well. We have the system of Sweden is divided into 7 police regions, and in each regions we have 2 regional coordinators working for us. So they are, so to speak, our ears and eyes on the ground. So we have a close connection to what is going on actually. Now I cannot see my presentation, so it's difficult. But oh yeah. I try to find my way through, so if I'm lost here somewhere, you can help me on the way, because I cannot see my presentation. It's in a Ukrainian language, I guess, which is a bit difficult for me.
Hi, Alan.
Yeah.
Yes, we are sharing right now. It's in Ukrainian language for our Ukrainian speaking audience. If you don't mind, could you please check your English presentation on your computer, and I will screen out Ukrainian version for our Ukrainian guests.
Yeah, I would try. I think I can start with it anyway. When it comes to Sweden, when it comes to the legislation, if I start with the legislation, very simply we can say that prostitution to sell sexual services is not criminalized in Sweden. To buy sex is criminalized, and it has been so since 1999. And it was evaluated after 10 years, 2009. And what was seen then was that the population in Sweden was very much in advantage of this 10-year-old law at that time, 2009, which they were not from the very beginning. So it was some kind of what we say normative effect that most people in Sweden, like 85% or something, thought that buying sex of another person is not really okay. And it was also, of course, related to a growing wave actually of trafficked women coming to Sweden. The punishment for buying sex in Sweden is normally a fee, depending on your income. There is a possibility of a prison up to 1 year, which has never been used. So no man, because it's mostly men buying, has been sentenced to a prison for selling sex, except one occasion. They tried it in one of the cities where the police could prove that this man knew that the girl he bought was forced, and that she had to do this. She wasn't volunteer at all. And in that case, they tried. They wanted to try it in court to get him sentenced for what you could call careless rape. And the court found that buying a woman who where the man in this case was 100% sure that she was forced to do what she was doing was more or less of a rape than just buying some kind of sexual services. So that's one single case, but I would say in some cases I will hope for more in the future. Of course, we have procuring is forbidden. Procuring is up to 8 years in prison. Human trafficking for sexual purposes, the organizer can be sentenced up to 10 years. But in Sweden, that is not likely. I would say between 5 and 6 years is more normal. I could also mention, when it comes to the sex buying law, that we use it very much in court. We use the sex buyers in court as evidence for the girls actually to support their sake or their view of the situation in court. And one example of that is, in many cases, women from Eastern Europe or Nigeria, you find them not on the street anymore. It's rare. Street prostitution is almost dead, more or less. But you find them on the internet, of course. And the sex buyer, of course, he takes contact with them on the internet, by phone or something. And he speaks with the girl, and they find a time, it will be settle how much he will have to pay, and for how long time, 30 minutes, 1 hour or whatever. And then he goes to the apartment, he gets the address, he goes there, and when he opens the door, he finds that the woman he meets in the door doesn't speak any English at all. She doesn't understand him at all. At that very moment, of course, he understands that she is sold by someone else who is behind the business. And we use this evidence, we use this man in court to describe how it works actually, how the girls are, if they were apathic, if they were sad, which happens. They said, I don't get any money. Could you please give me some extra and I can hide it for the pimp or whatever. And all these kinds of situations, we use the sex buyer in court to support the women. And I would say it works very well, because the sex buyer has no sympathy for the pimp at all. So I would say in many cases, they are happy to contribute to get them behind bars. I think you can change to the next slide if I'm right.
Yes, I'm already on the next slide.
Yeah. So can you just tell me what it says
It's
in the very beginning?
It's about victim support, that every victim or potential victim has a 30-day probation period.
Right. So every victim of human trafficking has the right to support and shelter, and a possibility of a 30 days reflection period, which means that during this reflection period, she is not forced or anything to speak with the police, for example. The 30 days of reflection period is just what it says actually, to reflect about her situation. Of course, from the police side, they want the girl to give statement if they have a trafficking case, but she's not forced to. If after 30 days she has to make a decision, Can I? Do I? Have I the courage? Is it dangerous to me? She has to decide if she wants to cooperate with the police if there is an ongoing case, or she can also say that I can't, I don't want to, I'm scared, or whatever. And that means that she has to maybe leave the country, going back home, but she will do it through the returning program that she can take part of. It's a voluntary returning program that is run by IOM, and they will take contact with some kind of NGO or something in her country, Ukraine or Romania or Nigeria or whatever, to in order to, as far as possible, avoid re-trafficking, to give her a chance to come back to a job or something. She will also have some kind of money to start some for education, maybe to the first time with a staying apartment or whatever. It's up to her actually to ask for what she finds necessary to start a new life, and she can have these wishes, and as far as possible they will try to meet up with that. When it comes to it is a bit interesting, a woman who comes to Sweden saying that she's not trafficked, she's doing it by her own free will, and she has no pimp and so on. She can also be a part of the of support and help and staying in a safe house at an NGO, for example, where the police will help them to the NGO if that is her wish, and she can also be part of the integration program. And then she will be sent out of the country, because if there is no certain reason for her to seek asylum in Sweden, which prostitution is not a reason for actually. But anyway, depending on which country she is coming from, of course. What is it more? Yeah, I can also just speak a little bit. How much time do I have left, by the way? 3, 4, 5 minutes?
3 хвилини.
3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Yeah, I can just say that okay, thank you. Over the years, when we've been doing this work, I think we have learned a lot. We started like 2005 with a project just to see if there was trafficking in human beings to Sweden at all. There were no such cases, so we had to start really from the very ground, and we had to find some kind of information, because within the police there was no such information at all. So we had to create or to get contact with the prostituted women at that time on the street level, and they were, as it went over the time, our best informants, because they know everything about this. They know who the pimps are. They know which sex buyers are, so to speak, bad people who are using abuse, beating them and so on. They know women who were under 18, children who were sold and so on. So we got a lot of information from these women. But it took some time, because it is interesting, I would say. We were giving them, in the very beginning, some visit cards, visit cards with your name, address, phone number, and so on. And it said, okay, another project from the police side. When I call you in 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, you will not be there. You will not be answering. You're in some kind of in another career or something. So everything you have to do, everything you deal with in this business, you have to build trust from the very beginning. And when I found out that you are on their side, they will be your best informants, because they know the game. And we also had a lot of help from cab drivers, hotel owners, and so on, because they also know what is going on in their respectively business. So yeah, I would say the police cannot do it themselves. They need help, or we need help from civil society, from the social welfare, from NGOs, and so on. So I might have missed something because it was a bit different to read my papers in Ukrainian, but I tried my best. So I think my time is out. So I leave the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Дякую, пане Мац. Дуже цікаво було послухати вашу розповідь. Я зараз передаю слово пану Алану Кейтону з Великої Британії, який розкаже про їх досвід впровадження дещо обмеженого, але все одно новаторського шведської моделі або моделі рівності в Британії. Прошу, пане Алане, вам слово.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for inviting me, and hello to everybody. I guess by way of introduction, I spent 30 years as a police officer in the UK. I've been retired about 8 years now, and I work in a safeguarding arena. And what I want to talk about is an issue that occurred in Ipswich in England in 2006, where 5 young women were tragically murdered by a sex buyer, which led us to look at the way we deal with prostitution in a small town. Now, what I would say is in the UK, the selling of sex and the buying of sex is not illegal. So we had to work around legislation to look at a different way of dealing with things. But if I can briefly tell you our circumstances. Ipswich is a pretty average town in England. It suffers with street prostitution, as many towns, but not all towns do, which is relevant. It's had a long history of prostitution. It was a port town, and a lot of the women worked in the area of the port. And going back over decades, it would appear to have been a sort of the reason for doing that was sort of social economic, where the women would go out to sell sex to feed their children and to put clothes on their back, etc. And I guess that over time, things changed. The only activity against prostitution, and particularly women in street prostitution, was law enforcement. So women were arrested, not much activity was taken against the men. And obviously over decades, it sort of displaced it in different parts of the town. And in the more recent years, up until the murders, it was in a very sort of very small area of Ipswich, about a square mile. There was sort of very deprived areas of the town, but also very high class areas of residential town as well. So it was a mixed bag. And I was the commander in Ipswich at the time of the murders, and we would respond predominantly by complaints from members of the public, and it was seen as a bit of a difficult issue. But the key driver, I think, at the time the women were murdered was and Mia referred to it earlier, was the very complicated and complex lives that these women were living, all of which were addicted to Class A drugs, often coerced by partners or boyfriends, often with no secure housing, living very chaotic and challenging lives. And as I say often when I spoke to these women, they would say, you know, that their only choice was that they had no other choice. And so it was a very, very difficult situation for a lot of those women. The next slide just talks a bit about the complexities around prostitution and how in the UK we kind of don't really know how we're going to deal with prostitution. So some of us see it as a moral issue rather than a criminal issue. Some see it as a crime of abuse and exploitation. Others see it as a crime, as an issue of social care and welfare. And a lot of people clearly see this as a career of choice, as we see quite often. So the UK, in my view, still hasn't got to grips with what it really thinks about the issue of street prostitution. So if I move on to the next slide, it talks about the situation in Ipswich prior to the murders, and the murder investigation, which was the biggest murder investigation in the Suffolk Constabulary in Ipswich, but it also one of the biggest that the country had ever seen. It was a very fast-moving serial killer that was happening, you know, right under our noses, and you know, but the murder investigation gave us a wealth of information about the women, about the punters, and we knew that following the murders that there were about 107 women that were working on the streets of Ipswich. We didn't think there were that many. We thought there were 40 or 50, but there were actually 107. There were continually every night, sort of 12 were were working on the streets. Lots of unrest from local residents and lots of complaints from local businesses, as you can imagine, all the usual paraphernalia, sex going on the streets, drug paraphernalia left, used condoms, needles, etc. on the streets. So a lot of antisocial behaviour and a lot of curb crawling, fast cars going around residential areas. So lots of complaints coming into me as the police commander. And that time, it was only an enforcement activity that we would carry out, which would dampen down the issue for a while, but it would always kind of come back. So moving on to the next slide, and that basically has the pictures of those tragic 5 women who very sadly lost their lives over a 6-week period into the winter of 2006. And I always refer to them by name because it's really important that we understand that Tanya Nicol, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Connell and Annette Nichols were young women who, for whatever reason, took this turn in their life that led to them being murdered needlessly by a sex buyer called Steve Wright. The next slide just shows, and I mentioned earlier, is a map of Ipswich, and it sort of shows an area where the prostitution took place. You'll see that there's the Ipswich Town football ground in the middle there, and there's a residential area, and there's a little sort of industrial area, and of course, it took place all in that. And the next 2 slides just show the extent of the murder investigation, and normally I do sort of expand on that, but I'm very conscious of time and we haven't got much time. But that was the front lawn of the police headquarters. The world's media descended upon us, and really it was a very tragic case for all of us that worked on that investigation. So moving on to the next slide, obviously very quickly Steve Wright got arrested and we had to look at how we were going to deal with this. I did know that what we'd done previously, and I'd been working in policing for 25 years at that point. I'd been a detective sergeant in the Vice team in the 1980s and early 1990s. I knew that punitive activity against women didn't work. I knew that the women were often coerced, fueled by drugs, and so often victims of assault and robbery and rape, and Mia alluded to that earlier, and sadly was a victim herself. So we knew all this was going on, but we really had an opportunity here to do something very, very differently in Ipswich, to trial a new way of working, to effectively adopt a Nordic style of policing by tackling the demand. And again, I totally agree with Mia. It's tackling that demand that's key, and offering support to vulnerable women. Moving on to the next slide. What did we do in response to Sumac? What I also knew was that this is not just a one agency issue. This has to be a multi-agency approach to dealing with this issue. It's not just a police matter, but it's a health matter. So we got everybody together. We got the local councils together, the drug and alcohol service, the probation service, the police, the mental health partnership, the local health managers, and we developed an overall aim to remove prostitution from the streets of Ipswich. That was our overall strategic aim, something that had never been done in the UK before. We'd always worked with trying to work in partnership and try to reduce the issue of prostitution, but we'd never come up with such a sort of innovative and sort of ambitious aim as to remove prostitution, and something that had never been done elsewhere. So moving on to the next slide, we wrote a strategy, and it was focused on 5 key areas. The first one was to identify the problem, and like I said, a wealth of information. So we created problem profiles for the women, for the locations, for the punters that were being used. We created dedicated resources to work with the women, for the police to work out on the next aim, which was to tackle the demand. And in order to tackle the demand, we needed to take a zero tolerance approach to enforcement against men who were curb crawling or were soliciting women on the streets of Ipswich. And by zero tolerance, I meant those men were arrested, they were taken to the police station, they were put in a cell, they had their fingerprints taken, their photograph was taken, their DNA was taken. And if they admitted their guilt, they would normally have a caution, a police caution. But if they didn't admit their guilt or they had previous cautions, they would go before a court and get punished. So that was the main police focus, was tackling the demand. Prevention. It was a lot of work when we did the murder investigation. We realized that a lot of these women had entered prostitution as children, you know, very young age, being exploited and abused by older men, or being groomed from care homes and getting involved with older men. And so we knew we wanted to prevent the next generation, if you like, moving into the very harmful area of street prostitution. So we did a lot of work with children's services and worked with professionals to identify the signs for child exploitation that would then be referred into the team who would work with these children and young people to prevent them. Developing routes out was our fourth strategic aim, and that was a key piece of work with a dedicated team to work with each individual woman. And it was about tailor-making services for that woman dependent on their needs. So it was very specific to each woman. So that included things like access to healthcare, access to dentistry, access to their children, access to education, access to housing. You know, all of these things were considered in the round with each individual woman. So what was it that kept them on the street? The only thing we didn't do in Ipswich was provide them with money, but if they needed food or they needed transport, we could help with all of that and help with housing, of course. And the final thing was to work very closely with the communities in Ipswich so that we had regular briefings. And I remember my very first briefing with the residents of Ipswich straight after the murders. It was a packed town hall, and they were very, very critical of previous police and partner activity in dealing with this issue. They said it had been around for ages. It's the oldest profession. You're never going to deal with it, particularly if you're not going to arrest the women. I was articulating how we were going to deal with this, and the public were not really on our side at the beginning. But over time, you'll see that changed. So, you know, we wanted to work with the community. We wanted to keep them updated. We needed their intelligence, and we needed to work with them to create environmental changes, to cut out the curb crawling activity, to brighten up the area with the local council, to keep the litter free, etc., etc. So moving on to the next slide, what did we do? So we did a lot of case conferencing with lots of the agencies, and we identified the most vulnerable women and the most active women, and they were worked with intensively and offered assistance from a variety of agencies to exit street prostitution. It was only if these women failed, we had to have, to get actually our strategy through, we had in the UK at the time antisocial behaviour orders, which were civil orders which we could impose on the women should they not engage with services. It's not a criminal sanction. Well, it could be a criminal sanction if they don't abide with it, but actually it's a civil sanction. And only 2 women during the course of the strategy, which was a 5-year strategy, and I'll come back to that in a minute, were offered antisocial behaviour orders, and then they complied with those antisocial behaviour orders. So there was no criminal activity taken against any of the women in Ipswich as we embarked on this strategy. I say it's a 5-year strategy. It was really important that we knew it was not going to be an overnight fix. These things take time. Drug addiction and complexities in these women's lives need a lot of time to deal with that. And it was quite challenging to get the senior people and the politicians to accept that this would be a long-term plan, but they did accept it, and that's the reason why it was a 5-year strategy. But we did use only enforcement against the women was only ever going to be a last resort. The priority was to focus on the demand and on the men. We were going to use technology, so we used automatic number plate recognition systems to identify cars that would be continually using those areas for curb crawling. We used CCTV cameras, and as I said earlier, we had very robust enforcement against all the curb crawlers in Ipswich. So I mean, this is the next slide talks about some statistics, and over the first 2 years of the strategy, we arrested 140 curb crawlers. So all these men were arrested, taken to the police station, photographed, fingerprinted, DNA taken. 130 men accepted their guilt and signed acceptable behaviour contracts. The other men who didn't do that ended up in court, and just as an aside here, we made a very conscious decision because the media were very supportive of what we wanted to do, but wanted us to name and shame all the people and all the men who were convicted. And we had lots of discussions about that and decided not to do that because we knew that most of the men who used the women as prostitutes were married or in long-term relationships, often had children themselves. And if they were named and shamed, the biggest victims in all of this were their partners and their children. So we made a conscious effort not to do that. But when we did charge the men and they did go to court, clearly that was in the public domain, and it made a lot of media interest in all of that. And very sadly, the biggest offender was a serving police officer from another police force who came to Ipswich, which got a lot of publicity, as you can imagine. So so that was disappointing, but it did send the message far and wide that actually, whoever you are, you cannot come to Ipswich. You will not be using prostitutes. If you do, you will be arrested and you will go to court. Over 80 women were assisted by what we called the Make a Change team, and that team comprised of officers from the police, from probation, from the local authority, family practitioners, social workers. So there was a big team that worked with these women, and over 400 children were referred into the team as potentially being at risk of sexual exploitation. And obviously this, you know, in the UK, child sexual exploitation has become quite a big issue over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and we've had some big grooming gangs in big cities and towns. But in Ipswich, back in 2006, we were really looking at that as an issue. So hopefully we've prevented a lot of children entering prostitution. The next slide just talks about the challenges, and clearly we haven't got time to go into all of that, but there was huge challenges. I mean, the aim of removing street prostitution, the negative impact of setting that aim was quite significant, because obviously, you know, everybody tells us it's the oldest profession, you can't do everything about it, but we needed to challenge that. You know, we can challenge that. We did challenge that. It doesn't happen everywhere in England and Wales, and so therefore we did take on that challenge. We needed to get agreement from all the agencies. That clearly wasn't forthcoming right at the beginning. We had to work very hard, because lots of people, as those of us who work in this area, know that there's lots of very diverse views around how it should be dealt with. And challenging negative attitudes was a big issue for me as the commander in charge of this strategy. Securing finances and resources. For me, there was never a better time to do that than after the biggest tragedy that the country had seen, in order to make a difference to women's lives. And it was about being coordinated, and it was about how we and the different agencies were coordinated in our approach. And we were all singing from the same song sheet. We were all driven to achieve the same aim. And continuing the strategy in the long term was also a bit of a challenge. So to move on to the next slide, and hopefully, Maria, am I okay for another couple of minutes? Just, no, you think I'm done? Okay, just to say that we did have the evaluation done independently in Ipswich, and overall it showed that it was a very successful. We effectively eliminated prostitution from the streets, we eliminated curb crawling, and that the University of East Anglia, who independently evaluated our strategy, said that it's been very successful and should be adopted as national policy. And I'll end it there, but there are a couple of other things, but I'm conscious of time. Thank you, Maria.
Дякую, Алане, за дуже пізнавальну презентацію. І я сподіваюся, багатьом було цікаво дізнатися, що в Британії є і такий досвід. Наступним я хочу передати слово лейтенанту-детективу Домініку Моншаму з Канади. Канада запровадила у себе моделі рівності у 2016 році. Вона вже практично 5 років працює, і найближчим часом ми можемо чекати почути звіт канадського уряду про те, які результати дав цей закон, як до нього ставиться громада, і що помінялося у ставленні поліції до жінок в проституції. Нагадую, що ви можете задавати питання. У вас внизу є кнопочка Q&A. Ці питання бачать всі, і ми ці питання обов'язково озвучимо. Або ви пишете їх в чаті, і я їх перекладаю для наших закордонних доповідачів і доповідачок. Прошу, пане Домінік, вам слово.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for you. It's early morning here in Canada. My first language is not English, so I will speak slowly. I'm from the French part of Canada. So since I'm addressing to police officer. I'm going to talk to you about my experience as a police officer. I've been in the force for the Montreal Police Department for 27 years now. And I spent most of my career, 22 years, working on sexual exploitation. So I entered the force as an investigator in the Vice. And when I started as an investigator in Vice, our main focus was to target the women in the streets and going after them, arrest them, prosecute them. So what described Mia earlier was very what we were doing. But early in my young age as an investigator, it didn't feel right, because when we met with those girls, we realized that most of them were vulnerable. They had the previous victimization, and we were only putting their situation worse by our own actions. And I know for you, but when I entered the police officer, I wanted to help those people. I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to go after the big fish. I wanted to arrest organized crime, street gang member. And I look at myself arresting those women who were in needs, and it didn't feel all right. And even though at that time the law were not the same as since 2017, we were having tools that we could enforce. We could at the time we could prosecute traffickers for procuring, and there was some tools, and we started to switch our mindsets, talking to the girls and trying to find out who were trafficking them. But honestly, it wasn't working at all, because we had a very big problem, and you have a slide down there which is explaining about what I'm talking about. You have the myth and the realities. So I'm going to keep you reading this and telling you that, and explaining you what was our main problem when we tried to switch from that approach, going after the traffickers and the clients instead of the girls. The main problem we had is on the street, our police officers, hospitals, NGOs were not dealing the same way or working the same way. So our street officer, patrol officer were still treating those girls as criminals. So when we came and we wanted to try to investigate, they were not open. They were still afraid. There was no trust with us. So I felt we needed to do something, and we started a training program with those officers. And for the few girls that we were able to make investigation in those years, we involved them in the program that we called the Survivors Program. So in that training, we met with over the years now, maybe 15 years now, we met with over 10,000 people, 5,000 police officers and 5,000 NGOs, caregivers, almost everybody that could be involved with those victims. Even the government and some TV shows were involved at that time. And since we did that, there was a switch, and we were able to start and have collaboration for victims. 20 years ago, it was just impossible to think about a girl coming up front and press charge against a trafficker. It was just impossible, because there was no trust, there was no bound between the police and those girls. Today, with that training, that awareness that's been true for many, many years, and that new law since 2017, we are overloaded with girls coming up from and asking for collaboration from the police. And we went from arresting hundreds and hundreds of women for prostitution to now 0 women that are arrested for prostitution, to hundreds of traffickers coming from street gang members and organized crime. So that switch is possible, and the impact on those victims is major. So we can see it now. And coming back to what I was saying about my goal, going to the police. You know, you when you work. Oops, I just lost you. Are you still there? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. So we just not only have an impact on those women now, we have an impact on their own family. So our program expand. We have now more than 15 survivors that are still working with us. We went from a team for the only city of Montreal of 4 vice investigators to now I have about 40 investigators that are working on sexual exploitation. 20 years ago, the word in Canada, sexual exploitation, was not used. It didn't exist at all. And now we are dealing with those traffickers. In my office, I have police investigators. I have civilians, victim services that are working directly with the victims and the investigator. They're, as soon as a victim is coming up front to make a complaint or to ask for help to police officer, she is linked with those victim service assistants, or they take care of her relocalization if needed, any care that she would need, psychological, medical, any need that she would need to be caring for. And I go back to what Mats and Alan said. It's the police himself cannot deal alone with that problematic. We need to be a full family to work and to address that problematics. So and the way we investigate, and you have that on the slide 5, the approach that we have is, once I talked you about the switch that we had on the victim, but on the investigation side, the way we're running our investigation is really very similar to the investigation that we could do as narcotics. So we're targeting street gang members, organized crime, and basically what those people are doing is they are making transaction. The only difference is that they're not dealing drugs, they are dealing human being. But the way to investigate it is pretty the same. We basically use the same techniques. We can use surveillance, you can use undercover agents and to go after them. So if you could switch to the other slide, you will see the kind of I'd say, yeah, you could see that basically those guys are the same people, and we're dealing exactly the same way. And before we made that switch, we needed to go on the field and to show that we were present for those victims. because they were not coming from us. And by doing this, we were doing on the street, on the massage parlor, and on any other field where those victims were exploited. And we showed up ourselves, and we were explaining what we could do for them and how we could deal in order to reverse their perceptions from us. So I think my time is about to end. I'd like to finish my presentation. Just give me a second. Yeah.
Dominique, you still have 5 minutes. So
Okay, perfect. I just want to tell you that I travel in Latvia, Lithuania, Central America, and most of the sexual exploitation right now is worldwide the same situation. Girls have been taken from the street, and they are trafficked on the internet, obviously, in massage parlor, in hotel, and Airbnbs, or that kind of places. And I put in my presentation some you will see some internet ads that are very similar if you travel over the world, and it's pretty the same. And I made those, I include those examples because I wanted to show you that all those situations are very common worldwide, and you could find exploited girls through those ads. There is indicators that are sometimes not obvious, but sometimes more obvious. And many times you will see girls underage, exploited, trafficked, and just by having a little attention on those details, as on the slide that you have in front of you, there is indicators. Girls that it doesn't seems to be voluntarily on her pictures is one of those indicators. You have the age, which is 18, exactly 18. From my experience, when they put the age at 18, 19, in many cases the girl is younger than that. In some places, coarse language to describe those girls is an indicator that she is trafficked by a street gang member. So, but depending of the region who you are, the cultural trends, you will find your own indicators in order to find who are those girls and which one are trafficked and which one are not. But the fact that they are advertising that they are independent is not a guarantee, obviously, that they're not trafficked. So I just wanted to let you know that everybody's in the same boat worldwide right now, and I hope that you find the motivation as a police officer to make a difference and to help out those women in your community.
Дякую, Домінік. Перепрошую, я відслідковую питання, які задають у нас в чаті і на сторінці трансляції у Фейсбуці. Всі питання, які я зловила українською, я їх перекладаю і передаю для наших доповідачів і доповідачок. Вони на них дадуть відповідь під час сесії питань і відповідей. А зараз я хочу передати слово пані Альді Йохансдоттір з Ісландії, яка теж багато років працює у поліції, і вона розповість, власне, про те, як в Ісландії була запроваджена ця модель і як вона у них працює. Прошу, пані Алдо.
Thank you so much. I hope you hear me. I have, thank you for the invitation, actually. It's an honor to get a chance to be here along with my colleagues and get a chance to tell you how it was implemented and what we do in Iceland. I have 20 years experience within the police in Iceland. In Iceland, we had my first case actually was 2005, where when I prosecuted both a woman who was a prostitute and her partner who was the pimp. And I thought it was really wrong. So 2007, we implemented the Swedish model, and now I'm going to introduce to you how we use it actually. So please, the next slide. And just for a little briefing, the THP, or human trafficking and prostitution legal frame in Iceland, it's of course the Palermo Protocol, European Protocol, EU Directive, and also governmental operational plan against THP. And as I mentioned, we have the Swedish model here in Iceland since 2007. And that is, as my colleague said before, decriminalizing the prostitutes and criminalizing the buyers. In Iceland, we have a normally fee for the buyers, or up to 1 year in prison. And the sentence frame is in the penal code, up to 4 years for the pimping or procuring, and 18 years in prison if it concerns children. Iceland is quite a small nation, so we actually do not have any street prostitution. So we normally have it locked within the apartments or in the Airbnb, etc. And please, the next slide. The criteria of the THP in Europe, as you see, and why I am mentioning it, it's because of the means. And you can see it exploiting the position of vulnerability of the person. So if we are going to prove a case on human trafficking, we need to have one act, one means, and one purpose. So we need to prove one in each category. If we have children under 18, we do not have to prove the means. So then we need to prove the act and the purpose. And please, next slide. And why we need to understand the vulnerability of the position of the prostitutes. And what is it to be vulnerable? It is exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. And in my mind, actually, most of the prostitutes or else everybody, they are in quite vulnerable position. Most of them, or all of them, before they start the prostitution, and at least all of them after they start the prostitution. So they can even be the vulnerable people are children, people with disability, etc., as I mentioned in my slides. And for fact, all of us can be in a vulnerable position in some stage in our life. So we need to face that fact. And next slide, please. And then the stereotypes, because we all have some stereotypes of what it is to be prostitutes and so on, when it is and so on. And then we need to actually destroy stereotypes, because prostitutes can be in every state. They can actually be rich also, with quite rich parents and so on, with been raised in good position, qualification, but in some states they are in vulnerable position. So we need to actually change the stereotypes and face the facts. And please, next one. As I mentioned, we have the Swedish model here in Iceland. And in my mind, it's no question that all countries actually should implement the Swedish model in their legislation. And why am I mentioning that? It's because it is the background. It is, as I said before, the vulnerability. They are abused. They are abused of power. Most of the prostitutes have been raised in a home where establishing domestic violence actually, also because if we are criminalizing the prostitutes, they have, as Mia said before, quite a long criminal record when they get out of the prostitution. So we need to implement actually the Swedish model, and it is my opinion. And we need to think: do they really have the choice? And we need to think about that also. If we are having criminalizing the prostitutes, in my mind, the government is re-victimizing the prostitutes. So that is my and once I heard the story from a prostitute who was a survivor, and she said to us, and I never forget this story, because she was asking us, have you ever seen a 5-year-old girl looking in a mirror and said, yes, I want to be a prostitute when I get older? So, and probably no one. And why it's illegal to buy? Because we need to also think about who are the buyers, actually. And according to research, 75% are married men looking for violent sex. So most of the prostitutes have been abused, have been violated. So and also because, as Mia and Matt said, and all of you actually have already, my colleagues, because it's related to organized crime. Because organized crime is where the money is. And so if it's all about the demand, and the prostitutes can give the police a very important information to work on to fight against the organized crime. So that is also a thing we need to have in mind. In Iceland, we have a reflection period up to 9 months, according to the legislation of immigration. And then it's next. I really like to mention, I forgot, sorry. And who are the pimps and the traffickers? And I come to that later also, because it's very often the partners, the lover boys, related person. So it's the prostitution and also the domestic violence. So it's really related. So and please, the next slide. The identification of THP, because I call the buyers in many ways, and it's this organized crime as a trafficking in my mind. So it's all about the knowledge, the stereotypes. It doesn't, it's not relevant to talk about the stereotypes because it's not normally like that in every way. And Eva Boudot, who was the head of the THP unit in OCD, she said this sentence: to identify THP is all about understanding what you see and believing your own eyes, because most of the prostitutes have this Stockholm syndrome. So they are not willing to speak to the police or us in the beginning of the investigations. And they also have a lot of threats, for example, against the family. So if you have an Eastern European girl from here, from Eastern Europe in Iceland, how can we protect her family in Eastern Europe? So in which what can they actually do? And they very often have a bad experience of the governments. And next, please. And then well-known features. They do not see themselves as a victim. Sometimes it's also about culture. It takes a long time to gain trust and accept assistance, and we need, and the government, the system needs to be ready for it. So we need to give them this time. This trauma, they cannot remember it, and it's a lack of knowledge also. So please, the next one. Yes, the indicators THP, it's more like that also in the, for example, at the airport and also within the country. What can we do and how can we identify it? And I will go through it. Yeah, probably next slide. I will not go through this. You can just read it. Yes, and the best practice, I really wanted to tell you about this, how we use it in Iceland, because as I said before, who are the pimps? And it's a very often related person, partners, etc. So we started a quality model. It started as a project here in Iceland against domestic violence, and we are having a lot of women who say they have been violated and forced to sell themselves and so on. So we are finding them also through that project. So I really wanted to say it, tell you about it, because we call it keeping the window open or together against violence. And please, the next slide. Because we wanted to target the first response of the police and improve the investigation, because we didn't get the case actually to prosecute, and we wanted to preventing the repeated violation, prosecution, option of restraining order and perpetrators' expulsion of home, and give assistance to the victims and perpetrators, and actually save the children's safety, because if you're raised in a home where it occurs domestic violence, you are 6 times more likely to be in the same position and in a vulnerable position than other children. So please, the next. And we also, through that, because I have a quite limited on time, we also implemented the one-stop shop for victim of violence, and also it includes prostitutes also. So we are having quite a lot in Iceland, even because we are quite small. We are having quite a lot of them coming to seek assistance to Bjarkarli. We mentioned that, this one-stop shop. And the stakeholders are all relevant, social service, children protections, NGOs, the police, and others. So we are working together. So the center of attention actually to assist is the victim of violence. And the role model is the Family Justice Center in the US, tailored to the Icelandic system. It was minimum funding, very qualified staff, social services, psychologists, and so on, and focused on the individual who seek assistance, not about the system actually. So you can go there for one-stop shop, and the system is coming to you. You do not need to go everywhere to seek assistance. So please, the next one. And the challenge is of course to change culture, and it's also within the police and actually in the society as all. We need to identify the victim of trafficking. We need to have proactive investigation, and it's all about cooperation and collaboration, like my colleagues has also been presenting. And we need to ensure the assistance for the victim. It's really, really important. And next slide, please. Yes, and I usually presenting this because THP cases always come up at 4 p.m. on Fridays. So it's all about to create a system, support for victims, not only in daytime when the government and system is open. The system need to prepare, and we need to have the system. And please, next one, and the latest slide, because it's all about that. I will tell you my story if you care to hear it. So if we are not saying to the prostitutes, what's going on here or something, we are not having this information. We need to talk, we need to ask for the story, and we need to have the care to hear it. So thank you so much. That was for me.
Дуже дякую, Альдо. Дуже цікаво. Я сподіваюся, у нас ще буде нагода поспілкуватися детальніше про те, як у вас організовані служби допомоги і жертвам домашнього насильства, і жертвам торгівлі людьми. Зараз ми переходимо до останньої презентації нашої сьогоднішньої зустрічі, після якої у нас буде можливість задати питання. Нагадую, що питання можна писати в чаті або використовувати оцю кнопочку Q&A оцю Q&A, і там ви теж можете писати питання. Питання, яке ви задаєте українською, я всі перекладаю англійською, і наші доповідачі і доповідачки зможуть на них відповісти. Отже, зараз я передаю слово нашій гості з Ізраїлю. Ми дуже раді, що вона змогла до нас долучитися, і ми дякуємо Любі Фейн, з якою ми спілкувалися минулого разу, за її активну участь у тому, щоб це стало можливим. Зараз ми будемо слухати пані Саріт Перец з Ізраїля, яка очолює підрозділ з протидії торгівлі людьми в поліції Ізраїля. Прошу, пані Саріт, будь ласка.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarit Peretz, and I'm the head of the Human Trafficking Squad in the Israeli Police. I'm happy to be here, and thank you, Maria, for inviting me. Sorry for my bad English. As part of my job, I coordinate the police activities, including intelligence, investigation, operation, collaboration with government authorities and NGOs, all in regards to human trafficking offenses of labor exploitation and prostitution. Furthermore, my role is to raise awareness among the Israeli police officers, training police officers and members of various government organizations, promoting legislation and implementing new laws in the context of human trafficking. I was more than happy to hear that Ukraine is considering adopting the prohibition of the consumption of prostitution law. And today I want to speak about the law in the state of Israel, the legislation process, preparation for enforcement, enforcement difficulties, thoughts, and what's to expect next. The legal situation in Israel. The state of Israel has a variety of sex trade regulation. For example, a person who lives out of the profits of someone involved in prostitution commits an offense. Whoever brings another person into prostitution commits a crime. Whoever advertises prostitution services commits an offense. Managing, renting, or holding a place, renting or holding a place for prostitution is criminal offense as well. There are also aggravating factors, and of course, any prostitution-related crime against minor is considered more severe and punished accordingly. It is important to understand that when a person works as a prostitution, he is not commit any crime. That's the situation in Israel. As can be seen, all the legal prohibition in Israel, even before the sex purchase ban, were focused on the exploitation third side, not the prostituted individuals. We all know that exploitation others in sex trade is usually accompanied by other offenses against the individuals in prostitution, such as threats, violence, fraud, etc. Human trafficking is not uncommon as well. Also, it is clear that in many cases, the individuals in prostitution are addicted to drugs, alcohol, and develop various, often comorbid disease. Israel, therefore, has a holistic system of laws that tackles different manifestations of the sex trade, making exploitation others for prostitution less viable and more dangerous. Simultaneously, the state has been gradually expanding the aid and rehabilitation services to make the existence of prostitution easier for its victims. The history of the law in Israel, prohibition of the consumption in prostitution law was adopted in December 2018 and implement early this year. The NGOs, as well as advocacy organizations, have made this achievement possible. These organizations acted out of the understanding that the sex buyer is the most significant factor in prostitution. Over the years, and after several attempts to promote the law, 70 members of parliament mobilized to cooperate with the NGOs coalition. Headed by the director of Task Force of Human Trafficking and Prostitution Advocate Nitzan Kahana. In 2014, the Ministry of Welfare and the Ministry of Public Security decided to conduct a national survey and positions and prostitution in Israel. The survey's proposed was to understand the extent of the sex trade. Its main subdomains, the age of entering prostitution, the average amount of clients per day, and other vital data. One of the most important conclusions was that 76% of all individuals in prostitution would exist if they had the opportunity to do so. A couple of years later, the Ministry of Justice interministerial team has adopted the organization's positions and concluded that the purchase of sexual services in Israel should be prohibited by law. In 2018, the Ministry of Justice, the Israeli police, and other ministries worked as a team on the wording of the law, derivative, meaning expected effects of the law, and appropriate aid. When the team reached the consensus, the parliament approved the law and adopted it on December 31, 2018. The original plan was to postpone the implementation until the enforcement infrastructure, including the aid services, is ready. The law places emphasis on rehabilitation, and so the law passed with a large budget for rehabilitation programs. While working on the law's draft, there was disagreement whether the law should be criminal or administrative. Each of the options has advantages, disadvantages, and different meaning in terms of enforcement. Finally, the Minister of Justice decided that the law would be enforced through an administrative channel so that the punishment will be fine. There is an understanding that the purchase of sex has been a normative behavior, if we can tell that, if you can say that, so far. And there is a need to gradual change of culture and social norms and perception. Okay, about the law. The law is as follows. Whoever commits one of the following offenses is liable to a fine as stated in section 61 of the Penal Code. So the first one is the purchase of prostitution services. The second one is staying in a facility that is designed wholly or partly to offer prostitution services. Such a person will be considered as someone who intended to purchase prostitution services unless proven otherwise. The purpose of this law is to reduce the consumption of prostitution services in Israel due to its abusive impact on the population engaged in prostitution. Additional purpose is to encourage existing prostitution and survivor and rehabilitation of its victims. The law separates the offense and the attempt to commit an offense. In case there is evidence that the offense has been made, a fine may be imposed. The second section refers to behavior that is generally an attempt to consume prostitution, and it will apply to the sex buyers present in the prostitution facilities, such as brothels or places differently than this one. Those individuals had an intention to commit an offenses, but haven't committed it yet. One example is a situation in which a sex buyer waits for his turn next to the room where another sex buyer is committing an act of prostitution. This offense was defined, among other reasons, to facilitate its enforcement. In this section, there is a presumption according to which a person in a facility whose primary designation is to offer prostitution services will be seen as someone who is there to pay for sex unless he has proven otherwise. This presumption is intended to alleviate the required, evidently, burden in situation where it is clear that the facilities is used for prostitution, for instance, brothels, as I said. In such cases, the purpose of visiting it clear and shifting the burden of proof to the suspect sex buyer is justified. I have two notes regarding to the law. So the law will be valid in Israel for 5 years at first, and will be accompanied by a research study that will examine the effectiveness of the law. At the end of this period, a thought will be given to the continuity of the law based on the research results. Section, this is something unique for Israel. Section 5 of the law prohibition the consumption of prostitution authorized the Minister of Justice to prescribe optional regulation. The Ministry of Justice decided to exercise his authority to prescribe the regulation, and these were published. The enactment of the regulation lays down a new and unique mechanism in administrative offenses, in which the default is the imposition of a fine, as opposite to the feeling of an indictment. The mechanism created in the regulation enables the consumer of prostitution to select a program as an alternative to the fine, operated by the probation services for adults. The regulation states that the program includes a psycho-educational workshop or a series of individual meetings according to the decision of the prohibition officer. In a total scope of 6 to 10 hours, the purpose of the program is to provide information and to develop the understanding of the damage and the negative impact of the consumption of prostitution on all those involved in the cycle of prostitution. Operating concept. For law enforcement, the police have designed an operating concept. The concept was based on the existing legal situation in Israel in the more severe offenses. A great deal of enforcement is performed within brothels and is a part of enforcement against the brothels operators, such as PIBs. So in this state of affairs, most of the enforcement is expected to be done by a detective, whose responsibility in brothels, for the operation in brothels. Also, when field police, the patrol police, handle an incident or a call for help, and it turns out to include the purchase of sex, they are authorized to handle this offense. That's why the training of all the police officers was crucial. The offenses of purchase of sex is complex. There's the need to prove the offense without any tangible evidence, making a reasonable basis for suspecting a violation of purchase of sex is possible through interrogation. The interrogation wherein is not executed in civil law procedures. Still, it is required to preserve the rights of interrogees, a protected value in Israeli law, preparing for law enforcement. We first wrote guideline principles that formed the basis for us to write procedure and build appropriate training for all the enforcement official. The Attorney General wrote a directive that outlined how to deal with these offenses, including in the context of more severe violation. It is essential to understand that once a person is caught while purchasing sex inside a brothel and he receives a fine, this situation is a bit complex. An investigation is conducted against the brothel operator. There may be a legal problem with exposing the evidence at an early stage of the investigation. A joint procedure has been written with all the internal police officials participating in enforcement, including those responsible for policing, investigation, and intelligence. A unique training was built for police officers who enforce the law, including investigation patrol, investigator, patrol officer, and detectives. The training was built during the COVID period, since it was not possible to train the policemen frontally. A computer-sized tutorial was created with the final test in the end. The study is unique for another significant reason. Police officers are not accustomed to handling individuals in prostitution. The practice of prostitution is not an offense in Israel, as I said, and police only handle individuals in prostitution as part of an investigation of crime related to prostitution. Now, in light of enforcement that will also include dealing with victims of prostitution, there had been significant needs to change the perception of police officers. They need a broader understanding of the sex trade. Therefore, the tutorial was built with the help of the NGOs. They created a video that involved numerous survivors, including men, women, and transgender people, who talk about past events with the police officers, their fear of the new law, and how they think the encounter between a police officer and the survivor can be improved. In addition to that, the NGO, on behalf of prostitution survivors, gave as important points that they think are important to be a part of the curriculum. In their own rights, a special things was born this study with a significant fingerprints of NGOs. Over 10,000 police officers were trained via this tutorial and were authorized by the police commissioner to enforce the law. The law came into effect in July 2020. However, due to the coronavirus, the authorities were not ready to enforce it in time. After quite a few technological and other problems and difficulties, we finally overcome the obstacle, and at the beginning of 2021, we started enforcing the law. Today, a single number of fines have been registered. A new law, by its nature, requires adaptation and assimilation, and we believe that the number of penalties to be registered will be significantly higher over the forthcoming months. Looking ahead, the enactment of the law has brought quite a few opinions, reservations, and concerns. Some argued that the law would lead to an increase in sexual offenses. Some argued that as long as prostitution was allowed, there was no reason to ban the consumption of prostitution as it violates freedom of occupation. Some argued that the law would lead to difficulties to collect evidence against brothels operators, pimps, or traffickers. The sex buyers are essential witnesses, and now they will have no motivation to cooperate with the police, as they are likely to receive a fine. Some said that the prostitution goes underground and disappears from the authorities' eyes, thus making it impossible to monitor the phenomenon and assess the extent. Over the time, Over time, we will be able to provide an accurate picture of the effects of the law. On a positive note, we hope that the law enforcement will reduce the consumption of prostitution, change the perception of the sex buyers, and open their eyes to the facts paying for sex means exploiting humans. We hope that the law enforcement will lead survivors to exit prostitution via rehabilitation programs, and thus we hope to build better society. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry for my English.
Дякую, Саріт, за дуже цікаву презентацію. Я сподіваюся, у нас теж буде нагода поспілкуватися про це детальніше. Можливо, ви приїдете до нас, можливо, представники української поліції поїдуть в Ізраїль подивитися, як це працює у вас, оскільки ми знаємо, що Ізраїль є великим хабом, через який продають сексуальне та трудове рабство громадян України. І така співпраця не лише з вами, а з іншими нашими колегами, які сьогодні виступали, я думаю, була б дуже корисною і цікавою для поліції України. У нас лишилося 20 хвилин для того, щоб обговорити те, що ми зараз почули, озвучити питання. Я їх, як вони надходили, перекладала, вони всі є у чаті для учасників і учасниць, і я зараз їх по черзі озвучу. Значить, перше питання до Матса. Наскільки суттєвим є свідчення самої жінки з проституції, коли призначають штраф покупцю? Чи можлива така ситуація, що її свідчення не потрібні, бо основними є інші докази?
Yeah, it depends of the situation. If there is a situation where there have been surveillance of the buyer, for example, then the police in many cases has evidence enough. If it's something that is reported by the woman, for example, I would say it's very difficult, because then it will be word against word. So it has to be some kind of evidence supporting the woman's story in most of the cases. But it's a very simple report. It takes like 10-15 minutes normally. And it's a statement from the buyer, if the police has been at the scene anyway. It's a statement from the buyer, a statement from the woman, where she more or less just has to say, yeah, he bought some kind of sexual services, that's it. And then the report will be filed and sent to the prosecutor. It will not go to the court, because the prosecutor decides what the fee will be in this case. And the fee will be sent, or the bill will be sent to the buyer. So in many cases, it's a very, very simple procedure where the buyer do not deny what he has been doing. He accepts the fee, actually. That's the normal case, most of the cases.
Дякую, Мац. Наступне питання для Алана. Питання таке: яка основна служба відповідає за допомогу жінкам у проституції?
Yeah, thank you, Maria. We spent a lot of time putting a team together that would work with the women. In most places in the UK, a lot of those services are from the voluntary sector, but certainly in Ipswich at the time, we pulled together a team, as I said in my speech, that comprised of professionals from police. So we had 2 officers, social workers, family support workers, probation officers to work with, and these were all sort of statutory partner organisation led, and we were told actually that may not work, because women would only work with the voluntary sector, and that actually we didn't find that to be true at all. That was one of the things that worried me when we set the team up, because it comprised of professionals from within the statutory services, like police and social care and adult services. But actually it did work very well. And I think once the women gained the trust of the team of professionals, they were happy to work with them, and clearly the results speak for themselves, and those women were given tailor-made services to help them exit and what they needed to exit. So it was, you know, it wasn't there was it was non-judgmental. Police officers were put into that role because of their specific skills and the abilities to deal and work with those women, and the whole aim, as I say, was to work with them to help them exit and to provide them with the support they needed to do that. Hope that helps.
Дякую, Алан. Сподіваюся, людина, яка задала це питання, почула ту відповідь, на яку вона розраховувала. Наступне питання я маю до Мії. Ваша робота з поліцією, наскільки вона є успішною, як ви бачите? Чи вони змінюють своє ставлення?
The feedback are very positive. Really, my objective was to put a human face to the women, to explain how to reach us, how complicated our lives are, etc. I think it has been successful in changing attitudes, in how the police approach a lot of women. Also put just that human face and the value and importance of building up trust and the importance of a kind word or a gesture. Also in things like raiding brothels and whatever, to looking for most investigations you rely on the victim testimony, and there's other things, how to look or lead more evidence-based investigations.
Sorry, Mia. Sorry to interrupt you, but the connection is really bad. Could you please check it out? We couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Давайте тоді дамо хвилинку Мії перевірити зв'язок. Тоді я поки що ми перейдемо до наступного питання. Я сподіваюся, що Мія зможе відповісти на нього. Так, значить, наступне питання до Домініка. Яка статистика успішних резонансних справ щодо членів організованої злочинності та сутенерів?
Okay, yes, over the 5 past years, we have a conviction rate in between 85 and 100%. Last year was 100%. For the Montreal region, we prosecute about 100 traffickers per year. So this is for the trafficker side of investigations. Most of them are from Montreal region, are issued from street gang members. So we have also some disposition for dangerous offenders, which we have maybe since the past years. We have 3 of them that have been declared dangerous offenders. So those are kept in jail and reevaluated every 7 years. But in Canada, there was never a dangerous offender that was released when they were under that program. So this is for the trafficker side. And for the client or for the demand, we work on both sides. We work on the adult, we made some kind of separation of dangerous and gravity. So we worked the demand on the underage girls. And on our criminal code in Canada, there's a mandatory minimum, which is 6 months. So most of the clients which are arrest for that offense are sentenced for 6 months. And for the adult side, usually it is a fine.
Дякую. Дякую, Домінік. У нас ще є два питання: одне для Саріт, одне для Альди і одне для всіх. Значить, Саріт, чи ви бачили випадки, коли жінки проституції відкликали свою заяву, захищали сутенерів, казали, що це їхні друзі та колеги?
Maria, you asked me the question that wrote it. Okay. So of course, there's a lot of cases that we can see women that protected the pimps. We just have a new one of 2 women from Belarus that working in Israel for 4 years as in prostitution. We know that from the customers. They said to the police investigator that they just doing massage. This is a very common explanation of a woman in these cases. And they said they never gave any sexual services, and they're not working as a prostitutions, but they did told us about the woman that hiring them, that she's employing them and giving them money, giving them home to sleep. And only when we knew that she exploded them, we took them to a shelter. And after 2 weeks, they just started to speak about the truth and that she do use them and abuse them in the past for almost 4 years. So this is something that we see often in almost all the cases, especially at first. When we just meet them, this is very common.
Дякую, Саріт. Дуже слушне зауваження. Наступне питання у нас для Альди. Як ви працюєте з кривдниками жінок, які зазнають домашнього насильства, і як ви працюєте з клієнтами жінок в проституції, щоб попередити подальші злочини з їх боку?
Actually, we do not work automatically with them, with the offenders, so to say. But we have a program which are based, it's not within the police, but in the system. So it is actually funded by the government. So they can have an assistant if they seek for assistance. So, and also because we of course speak to them within the police when they are in the interview, interrogated in these cases. And actually, in my experience of working with these cases, I've never been in so much contact to the defendant's lawyer as in these kind of cases, because they are so ashamed. They're always asking, is the fine coming? Can it go straight to my lawyer and so on? It can't go home to me because they are ashamed, the family, etc. They know about it. So we also speak to them about that. And also for the victim, actually, we are supported the victims via this one-stop shop. So actually we are supported them by every possible assistance we can, and funded by the government. So it's free assistance. And also within the municipalities, we are offering a social services, so they are having some also very much assistance from there to actually exit the prostitution and start a new life. And we have quite a few examples since we started this one-stop shop of the prostitutes exit the prostitutions, and then they are starting a new life actually.
Чудово це чути. Добре знати, що жінки, які зазнавали насильства, мають підтримку уряду у тому, щоб збудувати нове життя від такого насильства вільне. Я зараз спробую дати слово Мії. Якщо в неї нормальний буде звук, ми її послухаємо. У нас лишиться ще одне питання. Прошу, Мія.
Can you hear me now, okay? I don't know what's wrong. Sorry.
Мені дуже шкода, дуже погано чути, дуже погано. Ну, сподіваюся, не останній раз спілкуємося. Лишилося у нас одне питання, і воно для всіх, і у нас на нього є 5 хвилин. Чи ви зауважили зростання рівня насильства проти жінок в проституції після початку пандемії COVID-19?
I can start, and other one can come after. Okay.
Mats and then Dominic. Okay.
Okay. We have seen two things. Yeah, we have seen two things that has been raised. One is the reintegration program, which means that the women in prostitution has the right to be sent back home under certain circumstances. It has been blocked for them because of the COVID situation. Maybe it's there are no flights to Romania, for example, or to Ukraine or wherever. The boundaries are closed. There's no way to enter their own home country, which means that they are left in Sweden with no income, nothing, and some of them goes back into prostitution voluntarily or not. That is complex. That is complex, and also that the COVID situation means that people are out of job, they cannot find their income, and some of them are more or less forced into prostitution, or they are victims to recruit actually for criminal organizations. And I'd like just to stress one thing, if I have the time, about Ukraine, as we are in Ukraine right now. A couple of years ago, I don't really know, I think it's not really that bad now. We had 100 Ukrainian women coming to different hotels in Gothenburg, which is a pretty small town. And it was one of the hardest groups to speak with, because they were extremely scared, I would say. All of them, or the majority of them, came from the conflict area between Russia and the Ukraine. And what they said was, and we could never really confirm it, but it came from like underground information from the women. I can tell you this just to raise the issue, but I can never state anything. I don't want you to put it on paper, and definitely not my name in any papers. And they said that what happened was that paramilitary groups or military groups or groups in uniform, they were not really sure which side or who or their intention, but they came to their houses, apartment or whatever, and said, and their boyfriend, a relative in the family, was put into prison under fake conditions, probably under fake conditions, and they was giving a phone number and an address to a person, and they were told to call this person. He will offer you a job, and when you have earned like 20,000 euros, you will come back with the money, give it to us, and we will release your husband, your boyfriend, or whatever. And of course, this was a guy, an organized crime, and they were sent to prostitution in Western Europe. If that is true or not, we could not really, we don't have any evidence for that it was true, but it came from more than one of the girls, but always under the table, and never something that we could really, we could not open a file in these cases. Extremely hard to break these organizations, of course. Just a reminder of how bad and cynic this industry is. Okay, thank you.
Дякую, Мац. Домінік, прошу.
Yes, since the beginning of the pandemic, basically what we saw two trends. There was a higher pressure on negotiation from the clients, because at the beginning there was less and less clients. The pressure from the trafficker to bring back money was there, so they didn't change their minimums. And what we heard is that most of the victims were forced to lower their price and accept high-risk services, to provide high-risk, unprotected services. So we saw a lot of that since the beginning of the pandemic. So this is basically what changed on our side.
Дякую, Домінік. Я дивлюся, у нас вже час геть закінчився. Я дякую всім. Я не бачу просто більше вже питань ні в чаті, ні в сесії для питань. Тому я дякую вам всім за те, що ви знайшли час зустрітися з нами, розповісти про досвід ваших країн, поділитися ним. Я сподіваюся, що коли закінчиться пандемія і ми зможемо знову подорожувати, ви зможете приїхати до нас і розповісти це все особисто. Ще раз всім дякую. Це була надзвичайно цікава зустріч і до нових зустрічей у майбутньому. Всім дякую.
Thank you.